No. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I think we have a pretty good crowd tonight.
Oh, wow.
I'm here with Jeff Kleeps, and we are going to get started in just a second. I'm going to make a few program announcements before we get started. Just to let you know, in case you are interested, we do have another virtual trivia night happening tomorrow. That's tomorrow, Thursday, December 2nd at 7 p.m. Test your wits against our questions. On Friday, let's see, what's the date on this one? Friday, December 10th, we have a new compelling questions, and that is compelling questions. How do you think like a feminist? And that is going to be guided by Carol Hay, who is a professor, associate professor of philosophy at UMass, UMass Lowell, which is really exciting. We do have another art on Tuesdays, but it's going to be on Monday, December 13th at 7 p.m. Jane O'Neill is going to be back with a program called Sacred Symbols and Devilish Details, Northern Renaissance Painting from Campen to Bosch. Very excited about that. And then just in time for the holidays, maybe, there is a Holiday Pies program on Wednesday, December 15th at 7 p.m. And that is going to be a virtual cooking class on holiday pies led by Liz Barber. So I'm really excited for that one too. But tonight, we welcome back Jeff Kleeps. Jeff Kleeps recently retired from the Lucius B. Memorial Library in Wakefield. And we are very excited that he is still remaining the traveling librarian. And he's back now for another of his popular armchair travel presentations. This series highlights travel photography and stories and travel tips about destinations around the world. And he has been with us through the pandemic. It's been amazing. These virtual programs are great. This month, we'll be going back to Greece, where he just came back from, and exploring Athens, the bustling capital that is both ancient and modern, from well-trodden sites like the Acropolis to out-of-the-way neighborhoods, markets, and green spaces. We'll explore the city beyond what most visitors see. Athens is often just a quick stopover on the way to the Greek islands, but we'll see instead what makes this such a vibrant and cosmopolitan city. And I'm sure, hopefully, one day I will get there. And Jeff, we are so happy that you continue to do this series with us. Please send your questions to the chat, and we will answer them afterwards. Thank you so much, Jeff.
Thanks. Welcome, everyone. I'm glad. Thank you for having me back again. This is a great program for me because, as Jess said, I just got back from Greece about 2 weeks ago. And so I'm missing it already. And this is a great way for me to pretend I'm still there. And also, as Jess said, since we have a fairly large group tonight, I think it's best if everyone stays muted. But if you do have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. If I see them as we go along, I'll try to keep an eye on that and answer them as we go along. And anything I miss, we will definitely spend as much time as necessary at the end of the program answering whatever questions you may have. So I'm going to share my screen now and get started. Does that look good for everybody?
That looks great.
Good. Okay. Here we go. So I'm going to put Athens on the map first, just to give you an idea of where everything is, and I hope you can see my pointer. Athens is, of course, the capital and largest city in Greece, with about 4 million people, which is actually about a third of the population of the whole country. So it's considerably more important as an urban center than in a lot of other countries. The only other city of any huge size would be Thessaloniki, which is the second largest city way up in the north. But Athens definitely has an outsized role in Greece because so much of the rest of the country is very mountainous and considerably more rural. About 80% of Greece is mountains. And that's true even around Athens. If we zoom in a little bit further, you can see Athens is in kind of a valley completely surrounded by hills and mountains. I'll point out here, this is a map that a screenshot I took from Google a little earlier this summer when you may have heard in the news how many wildfires were going on. Greece had a very bad summer for wildfires, and there were some extremely close to Greece, to Athens, both here and even out towards the airport. And on the island of Evia, which is a large island north of Athens, that was definitely the worst area. But kind of putting it in the context of the area around it, both modern and historic, it's in the prefecture of what's called Attica, which is an ancient area, Attiki, and it focuses on the Saronic Gulf, which is here. And there are two very important islands, Salomina or Salamis, where you may or may not remember from your history lessons years ago that in 480 BC, a Greek fleet, an underdog fleet actually, defeated the Persians, the Persian Empire in the Battle of Salamis. And even today, the Greek Navy is based on the island of Salomina. The other big island is Aegina, which is out here, which is a very popular day trip destination. It's only about an hour by ferry from Athens. We're also going to, so in addition to exploring the city, we're also going to take a quick trip down the coast along what's called the Athens Riviera to Sunium, which is a beautiful spot, but also the location of a very important ancient temple to Poseidon. And that's a nice half-day trip if you happen to be in the city. There's extensive public transport in Athens, and I, as someone who has driven a car in Athens, I can tell you that's a bad idea. So if you ever go there, don't rent a car. The only reason I've done it is because I was driving in and out of the city and had to have a car. But if you are staying in the city, the transport is very easy. They have a very good bus system, a very good metro system, and it's very inexpensive. In fact, for only about $5, you can get a pass that covers the unlimited travel on the public system for an entire day. So it's an easy way to get around. The historic center of Athens, which you can see here around the Acropolis, is actually quite a ways away from the sea, about 3 miles, in fact. But despite that, Athens is still very much a maritime city. We'll look a little bit at Piraeus, which is the port down here about 3 miles away, which with about 500,000 people itself is also one of the biggest cities in Greece and also one of the busiest passenger and cargo ports in all of Europe. The city, as I said, is surrounded by mountains on all 3 sides. And most of those mountains tend to be undeveloped. And the modern city has sprawled in the flat area in between. And much of that development has happened in the 20th century. But it's interesting to look at ancient Athens just to get an idea of where it came from. The funny thing about Athens is it's a big city now. It was a big city in the ancient world, but for much of the time period in between, it was a completely unimportant backwater. This map of ancient Athens at its height in the classical period shows the city around the Acropolis, which is where most tourists would spend their time. And then the harbor of Piraeus, which along with Phaleron over here were the main ancient seaports for the city of Athens. And in between, you can see this really long thing called the Long Walls, appropriately. They were protective fortifications that completely isolated the city and the port from the surrounding area because it was the only way to protect them from attacks from the many city-states that over centuries were always fighting each other and changing alliances and so forth. These walls were destroyed by Sparta when Athens was defeated finally in the Peloponnesian Wars. The very first settlement of the city was probably, they think, around maybe 3000 BC on the rock of the Acropolis, which makes sense because it was a very safe, fortified place. History and mythology says that Theseus founded the city and united several of the tribes around the Attican area. And the mythological story of the city is that the two gods, Athena and Poseidon, had a debate over who was going to be the protector of the city. Each of them gave a gift. Poseidon gave a spring with seawater that came out of it, which is, I suppose, magically interesting, but not terribly useful. It would be much better if it had been fresh water. Athena, on the other hand, offered the olive tree. And she sprouted an olive tree on the ground of the Acropolis. And the people of Athens decided that Athena's gift was better and chose her as their protectress. And so from then on, the city was named after her as the goddess of wisdom. And it remains that way today. When I stay in Athens, I try to stay in an Airbnb that I found, which I really like, in a neighborhood called Kolonaki. That is a Greek word meaning little column, and it refers to an ancient column in the neighborhood square. And it's a kind of upscale neighborhood. I wouldn't go as far as calling it the Beacon Hill of Athens, but it's relatively upscale compared to the rest of the city. And it's also very beautiful and very close to a lot of stuff that you might want to see as a tourist. This is the view from the balcony of her apartment. And you look up in the back to a hill called Cavitos Hill, which is Athens' highest point, about 900 feet high. And I love this apartment if I can stay there, if she has availability, because the views from her, she's on the 7th floor of an apartment building, and the views from her deck are just incredible. The balcony has a perfect view of the Acropolis, especially at night. And in the other direction, looking up towards Ligavitos, we're right across the street from the neighborhood's biggest Greek Orthodox church, which is very pretty as well. It's worth it if you're in this area to climb up to the top of that hill, Ligavitos, because you can get a spectacular view over the whole city, including the Acropolis. And from here, in fact, you can see way off in the distance in this area, you can see the port of Piraeus. And over here, kind of off in the distance, you can see the islands of Salomina and Aegina that I mentioned earlier. The flowers you can see in the foreground are oleanders, which grow all over Greece. People grow them in their yards, but they also grow wild. And they tend to be both pink and white flowers. But when I was there in June, it was just gorgeous because the whole city and many of the neighborhoods were full of blooming flowers. Here's a view up the narrow streets of Kolonaki to the hill at the top. You can climb or you could drive if you prefer. But it's maybe half an hour hike up the path to the very top where there is a chapel and places to eat and an amazing view out over the city. The neighborhood is also very tight. As I said, I did have to drive around Athens a little bit, and this gives you an idea of why you probably wouldn't want to drive there if you can avoid it. The streets are very narrow, the parking is crazy, the traffic is just kind of insane. So I would recommend against it unless you absolutely have to. I did want to mention right across the street from where I stayed is a periptero, which is a very long-standing Greek tradition. Peripteros are just little neighborhood kiosks, and every periptero tends to have a neighborhood that revolves around it, and the people who live there visit it frequently, even daily, and tend to know the people who work there. And it's a place where you can buy cigarettes, lottery tickets, magazines, newspapers, snacks, drinks, water, what have you. And it's kind of like an American convenience store, but much smaller, and they're all over the place. So they tend to be almost a social institution. Here are some more views from the balcony. You'll notice that most of the buildings that we're looking at look fairly new, and they are. These are buildings that were probably built in the 20th century, many of them even post-war. Although Greece does have, or Athens rather, does have a good number of historic buildings from the 19th century. Greece became an independent nation after fighting a war of independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 1820s. And the first king of modern Greece, the modern nation of Greece, did a lot of building in the city in a sort of neoclassical style. So you will see a lot of buildings like that around the city, but much of the sprawl is 20th century and is not quite as attractive. But there are, the street life in Athens is very nice, very active. You'll see lots of local fruit and vegetable stores and places where you can buy, where ordinary Greeks would do their daily shopping. But there's also all kinds of other things, like on the right, this is a store, kind of a trendy urban store that sells only products that come from bees, which is why they have this sort of design on the front. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Acropolis tonight because I want to show you some of the other things that people don't usually know about, but you can't not talk about the Acropolis. It is 500 feet high. It's the word in Greek means high city, Acropolis. And it is the citadel that has probably been occupied since the Bronze Age, or maybe even earlier. And it's certainly the focus of what any visitor to Athens would spend most of their time seeing when they come. And it is absolutely worth it, no question. This is another view from the Cavitos in the evening. I want to point out just a couple of quick things here. Here's the Acropolis, and we're looking south over Kolonaki and the area around the central part of the city. But I want to point out just a couple of things. This very modern building that you see over here, we're going to look at that more closely in a little bit. That is the new Acropolis Museum, which was built only about maybe 10 years ago, 10 or 12 years ago. And it has a superb collection. We'll look at that later. I also want to point out, kind of, can't really see it off in the distance here, but right near the water, there's a sort of green park. That is the also very new Niarchos Center, which is a very expensive, very modern new cultural center that we'll visit. And the other thing I wanted to point out is just below the Acropolis here, you see a little teeny neighborhood in between the trees. And we're going to look at that in a little bit. I just want to call attention to where it's located because it's an interesting historic neighborhood that a lot of people miss. But we're going to see that shortly. The apartment I stayed in is actually, just see it right here. And at night, the view of the Acropolis as they light it up in the evening and as the sunset hits it is absolutely stunning. The Parthenon is dedicated to Athena, of course, and it is the most famous structure of the many that were built in Athens during the 5th century BC under Pericles. Unfortunately, it had a huge explosion because during the Ottoman Empire, they stored a lot of explosives in it, which was probably, certainly in retrospect, was a very bad idea. And at one point, there was a huge explosion that took out much of the structure. So what we have is only is what was left after that. But you can see here what a beautiful view is when the western sun hits it as the sun goes down over the mountains. And then at night, there is a new state-of-the-art lighting system that was inaugurated in the fall of 2020 to great fanfare. It now has environmentally efficient LED lighting, and it's a whole state-of-the-art system that they're very proud of. And I would recommend, if you have a chance, take a look on YouTube. If you search around on YouTube, you'll find some videos of the ceremony that they did to, there was a big sound and light show that they did when they inaugurated the new lighting, which is well worth watching because it's quite a show. My apartment was actually on the 7th floor, which meant that I had to get in this tiny elevator. I'm only showing this because I think it's kind of funny. I got to calling it Schindler's Lift because that was the only way to get up to the top floor. But it's a lovely neighborhood, as I mentioned. There's a lot of very nice homes, small parks and gardens. But you still see, this was right across the street, you can still see that Athens is a very modern city that is dealing with politics and economic issues and the coronavirus, just like everyone else is. So there's a lot of very current events going on in Athens. In general, it's a very safe city for tourists, but it's as ancient as it is a modern city, and it's the beating heart of modern Greece. Here you can see some of the older buildings from the 19th and early 20th centuries that have a little bit more historic look to them. A lot of these were built around the Art Deco and Art Nouveau period. This neighborhood also is known for two very, very good museums, smaller ones. One is called the Bernanke Museum, which is in an old mansion and is a sort of private collection along the lines of, you could roughly compare it to the Gardner Museum here in Boston. So it's not a huge museum, but they have superb and very interesting collections from different time periods in Greek art. And there's also a separate museum just a couple blocks away called the Museum of Cycladic Art, which is a museum dedicated to the art and archaeology of the Cyclades Islands, the islands that are the ones that most people tend to visit when they go to Greece on a cruise. Mykonos and Santorini are certainly the two best known, and they are the ones that you usually see on the front of a travel guide or a calendar with beautiful Greek photos, because they're the ones that have the white buildings and the blue domes. That's a very typical style of architecture from that part of Greece. And there's also some interesting archaeology and history of the early period, thousands of years ago in that part of Greece, and this museum is dedicated to that. So if you have a chance, it's well worth the visit. The heart of modern Athens is Sintagma Square. That means Constitution Square, and presiding over it is the Greek Parliament building that you can see here, which was built in 1843 as a palace, a royal palace. But since the 1930s, it has served as the Greek Parliament. And if you've ever been there, you've probably seen the Greek soldiers called Evzonas, who are the presidential guard. They do a changing of the guard that is very popular for people to watch, just like the one that's done in front of Buckingham Palace in England. There's some other important buildings around this square. One of the most famous is the Grand Britannia Hotel, which is one of the big sort of grande dame luxury hotels that goes back to the 19th century. But what you may not know about it is that during World War II, when Greece was occupied by the Axis, both the Nazis and later on the British used it as headquarters when they were in Greece. Now it's just a very expensive luxury hotel. The other thing in the square is, below the square is probably the biggest and most important of the Athens metro stations. It's the big hub where several lines come together. And it's called the Syntagma Station. And it has some excellent displays of archaeological finds. One of the things about doing any kind of construction in Greece is that the chances of digging into the ground and finding something important archaeologically is pretty high. So what that means is a lot of projects tend to get bogged down in bureaucracy while they try to decide what to do about the things that they found. But many of the stations do have these beautiful museum pieces displayed in the stations. Thessaloniki, which I mentioned is the city up in the north, the second largest city, has been building a metro for years, and it's become sort of a joke in the city. They insist that it will be operational by 2023, despite the fact that yet again, just this year, they found a whole bunch of foundations of early sites that have thrown everything off. So who knows when that's going to happen. Just behind the palace, the Parliament building, is a beautiful area that a lot of people miss when they go to Athens. It's 38 acres of national gardens, and it was started as a royal garden to go with the palace, but now it's just a public park. And it's a beautiful respite from, and a cool one also, because Athens can get very hot at certain times of year, from the hustle and bustle of the city. These are wild parrots just flying around. There are fountains, things for playgrounds for the children. And adjacent to it is this very imposing building called the Zapion, which was designed by a Danish architect, actually, and funded by a man named Zappas, who was an important philanthropist in the 19th century. And he's probably best known as the founder of the modern Olympic Games, which started in the 1890s. And unfortunately, he died before the building was ever finished. But it is used today for conferences and exhibitions and other cultural events. But it's a very beautiful building and is surrounded by these gorgeous parks. If you visit Athens anytime soon, you will notice some big changes downtown. Athens has for years been known for its pollution and its traffic, and they've been trying to get that under control. And one of the projects that happened in the past couple of years is something called the Megalos Peripatos, which means Grand Promenade, a huge project that was done under the current Athens mayor, where they took over a lot of traffic lanes, automobile and traffic lanes, and converted them to bike, bus, and pedestrian lanes throughout the core of the city. Here you can see an area where a whole section has been blocked off for pedestrians and for bicyclists. And you can see a tram off in the distance. It has been mixed success, let's say that. It has been criticized, because the Greeks love criticizing things anyway, as being too hastily thrown together, and it's not getting used enough, and it's making traffic worse. Fortunately, a lot of the things that they've done, like you can see here, are relatively minor and could be undone. They're just painting and bollards that they put up. So if they ever had to undo it, they could. But they are experimenting with a lot of this kind of change in the city to try to make it a greener city. Over the years, the various times that I've been there, I can definitely say that the amount of pollution is way, way less than it was, say, 20 years ago. And in addition, even smoking. Greeks are certainly known for being among the heaviest smokers in Europe, and that has gone way down as well. So if you're a non-smoker, it's a lot easier to be in the country than before. Here's another example of some of the public transit. They have a very good tram system and bus system. And this area that I'm showing you is kind of behind the public gardens. And there's a worthwhile thing to see, even if you're not interested in sports. It's a spectacular building. This is called the Panathenaic Stadium, and it looks new. It's made completely of marble, but it is actually an ancient stadium from thousands of years ago, and it was built around the 4th century BC and completely refurbished in the 19th century in time for the first of the modern Olympic Games, which happened in 1896. and you can just walk up and look at it, but if you want, there are also tours that you can take where you can go around and explore it. It seats about 80,000 spectators and is still used today for events. It's quite something to see. Here is another, just across the street, an example of some green architecture that's more recent, where Athens is trying to become more environmentally conscious. This is a modern apartment building. I remember years ago, probably 20 years ago or so, Athens made an effort to reduce the automobile pollution in the city by restricting driving in the city based on your license plate. Some different places around the world have done this. So if you had an even numbered license plate, you could drive on certain days. And if you had an odd numbered license plate, you could drive on other days. Greeks being the way they are, the solution to that was for everyone to go out and buy 2 cars. So it didn't really solve the problem. But things are much, much better than they were back then. This is another worthwhile thing to visit, although in the past few times I've been there, it's been completely covered with scaffolding. I can't wait for them to finish whatever they're doing with it. This is the temple of Olympian Zeus. It took so long to build, 600 years, that it was actually finished by the Emperor Hadrian, the Roman emperor, centuries after it was begun. It originally would have had 104 enormous columns. This would have been one of the largest temples in the ancient world, and it was 350 feet long. Unfortunately, now there's not much left, but it's still very impressive, particularly when they light it up at night. Here's a funny little thing I just thought I'd share with you because I ran into them around the city. It seemed to be an interesting local project. What it says is vote with your butts, your cigarette butts. And the idea is that partly they're trying to keep people from throwing their butts on the sidewalk. But you find these around the city, and each one has a little question, like a quiz or a survey rather. And you, depending on your answer to the question, you put your butt in one or the other of the things. This particular one says, the best decisions come from the mind or the heart. And you can put your butt in representing whatever your answer is. In this case, it looks like the heart seems to be winning a little bit on this side. And when I was back there again, just a couple of weeks ago, I noticed that there were several others with interesting questions around the city. It's kind of a fun idea. While I was there, I did visit some friends. I've been taking Greek lessons for the past 4 or 5 years, and these are some people that I met. This is a couple that lives in Piraeus, and I got to know them through the internet, actually, because they have a YouTube channel where they teach people how to speak Greek. And I've been enjoying their podcasts and their online lessons and their YouTube videos. And I've kind of gotten to know them through social media. And so it was kind of fun to meet them. We got together for coffee, and again, a couple of weeks ago, I met them again. We were visiting last month. And here is another of my teachers from 5 years ago. I went to Greece and took an immersive language tutoring program. And this was my teacher who runs a place called the Alexandria Institute that does both in-person and online lessons. So I hadn't seen him in 5 years, and it was fun to be able to get together and have lunch and meet some friends. Food, of course, we went out for lunch, and food is a very important thing for the Greeks. Here is someone, a little bird, angling for a taste of my revani cake, which is a delicious sort of orange walnut cake. And although the Greeks don't tend to eat dessert the way we do at a restaurant meal, they do have all kinds of little sweet pastries and things that they eat at other times of day. And you'll find all kinds to choose from in the bakeries. Another thing that they eat is oranges, because oranges are everywhere. And I found it kind of funny because of all the litter that I found in Athens, probably the most common item I would see is ripe oranges, which were falling off the trees because they grow literally everywhere. Every street has oranges that you could easily pick off and eat fresh from the tree. And there are so many of them that they end up all over the sidewalks. I'm going to show you around a few other neighborhoods just to give you an idea of some of the places that you might want to visit. This is Ermou, the big pedestrian street. I would think of this kind of like Newbury Street in Boston. It's the big shopping street, except it's pedestrianized, which is very nice. The entire length of it, all the way from Sintagma to Monasteraki, is pedestrianized, and it's a great place to walk around, particularly in the evening after dinner, and people watch, get ice cream, have a drink. And in the middle of it, you can see this very old church, which is actually from the 11th century. Here's a church that in the middle of this modern city that is almost 1,000 years old. There's some other interesting shops I came across. This one is called Mastika Shop, and I have to talk a little bit about Mastika because you may not have heard of it. This is a whole shop devoted only to mastika, which has a very unusual taste. It's an evergreen resin, like a sap that comes from trees on a particular island called Chios, which is way over in the far east of the Aegean, almost it's just off the coast of Turkey, actually. And this resin is taken from the trees and dried. You can buy it either in little hard dried bits, which you can chew almost like gum. And it's made into all kinds of different products. Probably the most popular one is a liqueur that is flavored with it. It's a very hard flavor to describe. It's slightly herby, it's slightly piney, it's sweet, and it's delicious in cooking and pastries and all kinds of other things. It's kind of hard to find around here, but there are a few stores that do carry mastika liqueur. And if you ever get a chance to try it, I would definitely encourage you because it's unlike anything that you've ever had. There are huge numbers of motorcycles and mopeds, unfortunately, in Athens. Here's a whole street with nothing but them parked there. And this is another reason why you probably don't want to drive, because if you are driving, flocks of these cyclists will be zipping in and out of the traffic, weaving in and out of car traffic, and then they rush to the front of the traffic light to be in front of all the cars, and then as soon as the light changes, they zip through and weave in and around everybody else. It was kind of alarming to see some of the way people were driving in Athens, particularly the delivery people. They've been doing food deliveries just like we have during the pandemic. It's extremely popular, and you will see young Greek guys holding a pizza in one arm and holding their cell phone in another arm and driving, weaving through the traffic on one of these things. So it's amazing that they aren't all dead. Another danger to watch out for is many of the sidewalks in Athens are made of beautiful marble, which is gorgeous to look at, but can be extremely slippery, particularly in the rain. So I have fallen more than once, and I would recommend that you be careful if you're ever walking around there, particularly if it's wet. I have to take you to the Placa because that's one of the places everyone goes. The Placa District is nestles right underneath the Acropolis, and it's the traditional touristy quarter, but it is still very quaint, very walkable. Much of it is pedestrianized. There is a lot of stuff like this, plenty of Greek tourist crap if you want to buy fake statues. You can get your picture taken with ancient Greek warriors. But it still actually is a beautiful historic neighborhood. It is one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city, which isn't much of a surprise given its location right around the Acropolis, the oldest part of town. So there are a lot of nice neoclassical buildings and monuments like this one this is one from an art patron in the 4th century BC. So it is actually quite pleasant to walk around, particularly because there's no cars. I mentioned earlier in one of the photos, I was pointing out a little neighborhood, and this is the one I was talking about. It's just around the corner from the Placa, and it's called Anafiotika. And it is nestled on the northeastern slope of the Acropolis and was settled in the 19th century, early 19th century, by people from an island called Anafi, which is one of the Cycladic islands. It's east of Santorini, south and east of Athens. A relatively small island, but a lot of immigrants from that island came to Athens, and they built this neighborhood that is remarkably similar to the style of architecture that you would see on the islands. There are these tiny little streets, a maze of little alleyways and stairways, and it gives you a feeling of the Greek islands in the middle of the city, which is just kind of it's very tiny. You can see the whole thing in about 20 minutes, but it's a beautiful little spot that a surprising number of people miss. And because it's on the slopes, if you go up, you get some beautiful views of the city, looking out over the tiled roofs and the churches back up to the Cavitos. And you can see these nice little nooks and crannies. There's only about 45 houses, I think, that remain today. Some of them have been torn down over the years. The streets tend to be unnamed. The houses actually have numbers instead of street names. But you can see how close it is to the Acropolis. The walls are literally right up above it. But particularly if the weather is nice, it's a lovely place to stroll around and get views around the city. In fact, you can see all the way over to the Panathenaic Stadium off to the east. The Cavitos to the north. And it's very close to the Roman Forum, or I'm sorry, the Roman Agora, which is a later addition to the city that has some Roman monuments in it. This one is called the Tower of the Winds, and has some very elegant sculptures on it. This was probably built in the 1st century BC, so this is in the Hellenic period. It's about 40 feet tall and was originally built as a weather station. Originally, it would have had a wind vane, weather vane on the top, and sundials and a water clock. It's one of the first ones ever built in Europe. I mentioned earlier the Acropolis Museum, the new one, and this is a closer up view of it. It was opened in 2009 to replace a much older museum that was actually on the Acropolis itself. And it's considerably larger. It was built to house all of the artifacts that they've ever found on the Acropolis site. It's very modern and sits right in the middle of the Placa. I highly recommend going there if you have a chance, because it gives a superb overview of the history of the city, particularly focusing on the Acropolis and the Parthenon, of course. Here's the entrance. And it was built, of course, as everything else in Athens. When they started building it, they discovered foundations from the early period of the Placa District and Byzantine foundations and so forth. So they have kind of built the museum over that. And they have exhibits. If you go down below, there are actually very nice exhibits about the foundations that it's built over. It's a huge museum. Ultra modern, and has excellent exhibits from all different periods of the history of Athens. It's also nice because of the views out over the city. One of the most famous monuments on the Acropolis is the Erechtheion, which is known for the caryatid sculptures that are used as columns to hold up the pediment. The ones that are actually on the building now are reproductions, because the originals were just becoming too damaged by the elements. So these are the originals that are in the museum. And the top floor of the museum is completely dedicated to the Parthenon marbles, so that you can see what the original pediments and frieze sculptures would have been. The museum was actually designed to accommodate the Parthenon marbles should they ever come back to Greece. And if you follow the news at all, you know that this has been this is basically a 200-year-long argument between England and Greece. Lord Elgin took the marbles back to England in what has been widely considered to be an inappropriate theft of Greek heritage in 1816. And there's been continual debate over whether Britain should give them back to Athens. One of the things that was an issue for a long time was the idea that Greece did not have an appropriate place to display them, and they were safer in British hands because they were in the British Museum. So Greece was not going to put up with that, so they built this spectacular museum, which is specifically designed to accommodate the marbles should they ever be returned. And one of the nice things about it, if it ever should happen, is that there's this beautiful view back up to the Parthenon, so that you would be able to see the sculptures and the building where they would have originally been mounted in one location. So we'll see. There's every so often you see more diplomatic discussions. I actually saw there was a survey that said 56% of Brits think that Britain should return them to Greece. That doesn't mean that's going to happen, but we'll see. But it is a very, very elegant, very well done museum that's worth the visit, just to understand the importance and the context of the Acropolis in the city. And you can see the imposing fortification walls. The Acropolis is more than just a big hill. It is actually a major fortification, and it's quite strenuous to go all the way up to the top. In addition to the Acropolis, there's a number of hills nearby. The Areopagus, the Pnyx, and the Philopapou Hill, all of which are very fun to explore, and they're also nice and green. So given all the concrete and the sprawl in Athens, it's kind of nice to have this beautiful park space in the middle, much of which has been made vehicle free, which is nice, so that it's a bit of a respite from the bustle of the rest of the city. One of the monuments on the hills is a prison that is said to be that of Socrates. You remember that Socrates was jailed before his trial for corrupting the youth of Athens. This probably isn't really the place where he was kept, but it makes a great story. And it is actually several rooms that are carved into the stone of the hill. Probably, they think it was probably originally a dwelling at some point in history. And it was used, I think more interestingly, it was used just in this century as a place to hide a number of the artifacts from the museum during World War II. But if you climb up to the top of the Areopagus, you can see all over Athens. The Areopagus is named for the war god Ares, and in classical Athens, it was the site where the governing council of the city would have met. And way off in the distance, all of those cypress trees that you can see are one of the city's largest cemeteries. It's also worth it to climb some of these hills because you get an excellent view of the Acropolis from close up. Here you can see the Propylaea where you enter, the Erechtheion in the distance there, and also a couple of the important ancient amphitheaters that are at the base. Here's a close-up of the walls with the Cavitos looming in the distance. This is actually from one of the other hills called the Pnyx, which is a vast open area that was used for holding public assemblies. It's still a very big open hillside, and it's estimated to have held accommodated about 6,000 people Men, of course. Bear in mind that as democratic as Athens was in those days, democracy only extended to men, and certainly not slaves, certainly not women, but it was still a very important step in the development of governance in ancient cultures. And the other big hill is called Philippapu Hill, which faces south. Technically, it's actually called Museion Hill, the Hill of the Muses. But at a later point, there was a huge mausoleum. I didn't show a photograph of that. This huge mausoleum to someone named Philopappos, who was a prominent prince in the early Roman period in what is now actually Armenia, but was at the time part of the Roman Empire. And when he died, his family erected this enormous monument to him on this hill. But it's a great place to walk. Hardly any people go there because it's a little bit off the beaten path. But if you go, you have an amazing view south over the Saronic Gulf. You can see the Peloponnese in the distance. And I should point out here, this avenue here that goes down to Piraeus is, if you remember the map I showed you earlier that had the ancient map that showed the long walls that connected, the fortification walls that connected central Athens to its port. This avenue is where those walls originally were. Now it's one of Athens' big boulevards. So now it's basically just a very quiet and rugged hill that you can clamber over in the middle of the city. Below it, there are some very nice neighborhoods to explore. Tourists rarely go here, but Petralona and Philoppapu are nice places. They're good places to stay because they're very conveniently located to a lot of the major sites. They have a lot of pedestrian areas, and they have some great cafes and guest houses and restaurants and so forth. This neighborhood in particular is known for having immigrants from the north. So a lot of the houses that were built there are built in this stone style that is very typical of that part of Greece. And there are also some just nice little neighborhood churches. This is a modern church, not an ancient one, in Philoppapu. Probably the most popular place to for a tourist to visit, and it really is very centrally located, is something called Monasteraki Square. This is a major meeting point in the city. It's also another one of the major metro stops where lines converge. It's named after a monastery that is now long gone, although the church exists just around the corner. You'll see that in a minute. The mosque, this is a mosque dating from the Ottoman time period, which is now part of the Greek Folk Art Museum. And on the right, this building here is the metro. So it's a very convenient place to come because it's so close to all of the big stuff that a visitor would want to see in the city. Behind the mosque are the ruins of, these are the columns that are almost all that's left over Emperor Hadrian's library. And of course, it is a tourist area. So on a less lofty plane, you can still buy lots of tourist junk like t-shirts, fake statues, and as you can see in this picture, various rude things. But more importantly, it's just a really nice social center. Think of it kind of like the Faneuil Hall Marketplace in Boston. It's where locals and tourists alike come because there's a lot of things to do. There's cultural events going on. It's a major transportation node. This is the church, all that remains of the monastery that the square is named after. But it's lit up at night. It's a meeting spot, and there's a beautiful view of the Acropolis looming over it. It's also very close to a neighborhood just to the west. There's a series of blocks that are a huge pedestrianized shopping district that is kind of, if you've ever been to any kind of Eastern bazaar, like in Istanbul or Morocco, it's almost like that. Very narrow streets, with all kinds of shops selling tourist stuff, but also clothes, art, crafts, souvenirs, specialty shops, pretty much anything you can think of. It's a great place to get lost and just walk around. And again, it's another one of the areas of the city that has no vehicles, so it's a much pleasanter place to stroll around. Here's the sky over the mosque. And also not too far from Monasteraki, just north, if you go up another one of the streets, is the Central Public Food Market, which is open every day but Sunday and sells fruit, vegetables, fish, meat, coffee, spices, tea, oil, olive oil, fruits, nuts, anything that you can imagine. And this is another one of those places that is really, it's not, it's enjoyable for tourists, but it's really for the citizens of Athens. This is where they go to do their shopping. And it was built in 1886, which is why it has that sort of neoclassical look to it. But it's still, even today in 2021, is one of the busiest markets in the whole city. You'll see people selling, here's a woman selling garlic outside, but inside, the fish market is almost like a museum of all the different kinds of fish. It's fun to learn the Greek words for different kinds of foods. No surprise, octopus is very popular in Greece, as is swordfish. There's also all different kinds of meats. Greeks are big eaters of beef, pork, and lamb in particular, also, as well as chicken. And just a block away or so is another big square where City Hall is located. So you'll see the City Hall, and also the National Bank of Greece is here. And it's also an important square because it has a big statue of Pericles, who was a statesman and military general from the 5th century BC, back in the height of classical Athens, one of the most famous ancient Greeks. And this leads into an area called Academia and Panepistimiou, which is sort of the academic area of Greece, where a lot of the major cultural institutions are. You'll find the Archaeological Museum, which is one of the best ancient museums of ancient art in the world, and also the National Historical Museum, the former National Library, and also here the Academy of Athens. Many of these buildings that you're seeing, although they look ancient, they were designed in the 19th century by the same Danish architect who did the Zappeion that I talked about earlier. He also designed a whole bunch of stuff in other parts of Europe, particularly in Vienna. Here on the Academy, you can see statues of Athena and Apollo, and seated in front is Socrates. So a little bit more of a close-up. Also, Athens University is located here, and the old National Library. This is the original National Library, which has since been replaced by a very modern one, which I'll show you later. And the Metropolitan Cathedral of Athens. This is the biggest and most important Orthodox church in the city, even though it is certainly not new, or not old rather. It's from the late 19th century. And you can see a number of other Byzantine monuments throughout the city as well. Here's another church in the Monasteraki district. Also very close by here is the Ancient Agora, with a number of monuments that are still in pretty good shape. This is a model of what it would originally have looked like. These two buildings, this one here and this one here, are still mostly in the same condition. Most of the other buildings are ruins at this point, but it's well worth a visit to see where ancient Athenians would have come to meet. This is the Stoa of Athabos, which was built around 150 BC and was used for several centuries until it burned. And then in the 1950s, it was completely rebuilt. So what you see here is actually a complete reconstruction based on the original design, and it houses a museum, a history museum. And it's kind of interesting because you can see on the lower level, these are Doric style columns. And if you go up to the second floor, you can see Ionic columns. The museum in there is very well done. And it gives you a nice view out over the entire area that the Agora takes over. This is a small church, obviously built much later, but still quite old. This is a 10th century church called the Church of the Holy Apostles from the Byzantine era. The highlight of this site is, and certainly the best preserved structure, is the Temple of Hephaestus, the Hephaestion. He was another one of the major Olympian gods. And this is one of the best preserved temples anywhere in the ancient world. You can see, unlike the Parthenon, most of it is still, you can still really get a sense of what the ancient temple would have been like. It's also kind of enjoyable because it's up high. It's on a little hill that gives you a view out over the Agora. It was built about the same time as the Parthenon as well. Many of these structures were built roughly in the 5th century BC and in a very similar Doric style. Ironically, one of the reasons why it's in such good shape is that for about 1,000 years, it was used as an Orthodox Christian church. So that's why they took such good care of it instead of ripping it apart over the years. But we're lucky to be able to benefit from that. So here's a view from the terrace looking out over. You can see the Stoa that we just visited, as well as that small church. The temple is also worth visiting just because, unlike a lot of other temples where the original artwork and sculptures have been removed, many of the original frieze sculptures are still in their original location. So you can see how they would have fitted into the architecture of the temple. A few blocks away is something very new. The Keramikos neighborhood was originally the Potter's District. That's where, in fact, where we get the word ceramic from, Keramikos. And it's also the site of an original cemetery, which is now a historic site that you can visit as well, an ancient cemetery. But on the border between that neighborhood and another neighborhood called Gazi is this old gas works. You can see the tanks and the smokestacks and so forth. And it was recently completely redone and converted into a huge cultural center called Technopolis. So there's art, there's music, technology exhibits, kind of like a science center. It's I didn't have time to actually go in and visit it, but I wanted to at least see what it looked like, and it's really revitalized that neighborhood. Also in this corner of town, north of the old Agora, is an area called Napoli and another neighborhood called Exarchia, which are right next to each other. They're kind of on the west side of that big Cavitos Hill. There's a lot of graffiti, very vibrant street art. And they tend to have a little bit of a bad reputation because it's known as an anarchist neighborhood. There's a lot of immigrants. It's a relatively poor part of the city, and it does have a higher crime rate than some other parts of the area, but certainly in the daytime, it's perfectly fine to walk around there. I'd be a little more cautious there at night, but it's also one of the best parts of the city for publishing houses and bookstores, because it's kind of behind the academic area. So there's huge numbers of independent bookstores and publishers, but it's just a great place to walk around if you like street art. And it's unfortunate that it gets this bad reputation because there's really a lot of life there. There's some great cafes, and it's just, it's worth a stroll. Back downtown again, some other random neighborhoods that I'll show you. This is back in right near Monasteraki on Herbu Street. But all over the city, you'll find these interesting examples of ancient and modern things squished together, because if you're going to build a skyscraper and unfortunately there's a Byzantine chapel in the way, well, you find a way to build around it. I spent some time working my way out to the coast, so I went through this neighborhood called Kalithea, which means beautiful view. It's a very non-touristy area, mostly residential, but there were a few parts of the 2004 Olympics that were held here, and I enjoyed walking there just because it gives you an idea of what modern Athens is like, what Athenians live like. They have a very big modern plaza in the middle with cafes and playgrounds, fountains. If you follow sports at all, you've probably seen this guy. This is Stefanos Citypass, who is, I think, still the third ranked tennis player in the world. That may have changed in the past few months. His face is everywhere. He's very popular with the Greeks. So he's on every bus station. Every bus stop has a poster of him advertising something. Here, he's totally normal. He's just like us. He eats pot noodles. The other famous young player right now is Yanis Antetokounmpo, who was also born in Athens. He and Sisypas are kind of close in age. Although he was born in Athens, now he's playing in the NBA here in the United States. But if you work your way all through these neighborhoods, you eventually get down to the water, where I pointed out in one of the earlier slides, the Stavros Niarchos Cultural Center. The Niarchos Foundation is a major philanthropic organization in Greece, which I believe comes from shipping money. They have funded a wide range of things throughout Greece. And this is certainly the biggest and the best known. This was almost a $900 million project that was completed about 5 years ago and designed by the architect Renzo Piano, who you may or may not have heard of him, but he's a very famous Italian architect. In Boston, he designed the addition to the Gardner Museum. That's one of the things he's known for here, but he's built things all over the world. And this huge complex, you can see it kind of, there's a slow ramp that works its way up to the top here, where this huge canopy covers the new Greek National Opera. And then down below, underneath the park, is the new National Library of Greece. And even if you're not attending any actual events there, it's a beautiful place to walk around because of this park. The entire complex was designed to be very environmentally friendly and green, both literally and figuratively. The roof of the complex, part of it has a parking garage underneath, and all the services and the library and so forth. But the entire roof is a park. There's playgrounds for children, there are fountains, there's a reflecting pool, and there are all native Greek plants. All the things that you see here are full-size olive trees. I can't imagine what it must have cost to find and relocate these obviously very old and very large olive trees. And all of the plant life that you see around here is typical Greek Mediterranean plant life. And there are, again, views over the city. Here's another interesting green building. This is not part of the project, it just happens to be in the same neighborhood, but you can see it's got a whole park with full-size trees on the roof. As you get up close to the Opera House, there's just a field of wild grasses. And the roof of this enormous building, this canopy here, is completely covered with solar panels. So in theory, the entire complex is supposedly carbon neutral. And when you get to the top, you do get a beautiful view back to the oldest part of the city. Here you can see way off in the distance, you can see the Acropolis and Cavitos Hill, which is about maybe 3 miles or so. Here's a view of what's under this huge park. Here you can see the National Library, and here's a view of the lobby. A very modern structure compared to the one that I showed you earlier, which was a 19th century building. But again, as I said, even if there's nothing in particular that you want to see there, or you're not attending an opera or doing research, it's an interesting place to visit. It's a little bit out of the way, and most tourists would never bother to go there. But you'll find lots of locals strolling around with their kids and enjoying the views. It's also very beautiful at night when everything is lit up over this massive reflecting pool. Moving down the coast, I want to take you quickly through Piraeus, which is part of the Athens metro area, but about 5 miles away from the historic center. But it's the port of Athens. It's the modern port, but it was also the port 2,500 years ago. Today, it serves about 20 million passengers a year, and that includes both ferries that are going all over Greece to the islands, and also cruise ships that stop there on various Mediterranean cruise itineraries. There's also 2 big sports venues in the area too. This particular one is called the Peace and Friendship Stadium, which tends to be used for mostly basketball, hockey, volleyball, things like that. And then a little bit further away is the slightly larger Karaiskaki Stadium, which is for football or soccer. And it's named for one of the military leaders in the War of Greek Independence. And both of these arenas are used frequently today. But Piraeus, most people would not bother to go to Piraeus unless they were taking a cruise or visiting the islands. Here's the main port where we just went to wander around and look at all the ships, because it's just kind of fun to see the enormous variety of passenger ships that are there. There are cruise ships, ferries leaving to all different parts, all of the different islands, the Peloponnese and also Crete. There are car ferries and passenger ferries. There are high-speed ferries. A number of them, like this one here, these are called delphini, which is the Greek word for dolphin. And these are passenger catamarans that are high-speed ferries. They don't take cars, they only take people, but they zip from one island to another much faster than the older ferries used to do, and certainly faster than a lot of the car ferries. Behind it, you can see a traditional, it looks like it's a Viking cruise ship. Athens is not surprisingly a major Mediterranean cruise port for the large cruise ships that are traveling around the Aegean and the Eastern Mediterranean. But in addition to the big cruise and ferry port, there's a couple of smaller marinas around the corner that are very upscale neighborhoods with private pleasure boats and yachts. Here we're looking east to another one of the ones a little further down. There's just a whole long string of ferries and marinas and neighborhoods along the coast. I did have to show you, just on the humorous side, here's a couple of photos of typical Greek parking jobs. Greeks are very creative at finding a space where you might not think there was one. And fortunately, most of the cars are very small, so they can get away with it. Another of the big stadiums, this is the first one I showed you, but you can see way off in the distance, you can see all the way back to the Acropolis in the distance. Piraeus is, in general, a very modern neighborhood and mostly residential, and very hilly, surprisingly hilly. and has all these seaside amenities. There's lots of cafes and parks and promenades. You can pretty much walk all the way around the coast and get nice views. This is an interesting plaza that has a memorial to the genocide of the Pontic Greeks, who you probably haven't heard much about. Those are the Greeks who lived on the northern coast of Turkey, the side that fronts on the Black Sea. And after World War I, the Ottoman Empire tried to eliminate a number of ethnic groups in Anatolia. The Armenian genocide is certainly the one that is most famous. And then over a period of years, roughly between like 1918 and 1922, estimates range between maybe 200 to 350,000 Pontic Greeks also experienced genocide. And it was a tragedy that's not quite as well known as some of the others, but here is a very moving memorial to them. I was there this past month, but I was also there in June, which is Pride Month. And so I thought it was kind of interesting that Goody's Burger House, which is a chain that you find all over Athens, was celebrating Gay Pride for the month. Their slogan in Greek, what it says is, our slogan is love, Syntagma Square, and you can buy colorful Gay Pride burgers during the month of June. And here's just some more views around the beautiful port area around Piraeus. And a couple of more of the stadiums. This one is a little further to the east in a neighborhood called Falliro. And this stadium was built specifically for beach volleyball, believe it or not, and was used in the 2004 Olympics. I'm going to finish up the program by taking you on a quick day trip, not even a day trip, a half day trip. It's to show you on the map. We've been here in Athens and a little bit down in Piraeus, down at the port. But you can take a drive, and if you don't want to do it on your own, there are innumerable companies that will take you on a bus trip for usually half a day or so. It's a maybe hour and a half tops to go down the coast. It's kind of roughly comparable to taking a trip from Boston to Gloucester or Newburyport. And you go down along the coastline, which is actually quite beautiful. It's called the Athens Riviera, about maybe 30 miles or so. And it's quite something because as big a city as Athens is, it doesn't take very long. Only a few kilometers out of the city, you feel like you are in a completely different area. I wouldn't call it rural, but it certainly has a much more laid back feel once you get out of the immediate suburbs. It's very much less developed, and you feel like you're far away from the city. It's a beautiful coastline. Here's some fish farming going along, and there are views in the distance off to some of the islands and even the Peloponnese in the distance. But the highlight at the end of the trip is the temple to Poseidon, which sits on a promontory way at the tip, about 200 feet up. And it's a Doric style temple built again about the same time period as some of the others we've looked at, roughly the 4th century BC, about the same time as the Parthenon. Of the original 36 columns, there's only 15 that are there today, but probably what makes it a worthwhile place to visit is the incredibly beautiful location. Here's a view looking east, and you can see off in the distance, this is a very long, skinny island called Makronisos, which means long island, actually. But it's a beautiful temple. It originally would have had a 20-foot, enormous 20-foot bronze statue of Poseidon in it. And even in ruins today, you do get a pretty decent sense of how imposing the structure would have been and how big it would have been. And of course, the view looking up and down the coast is quite something. This is looking back towards Athens. If you get up close to it, there's a lot of interesting old graffiti. This is not new graffiti, this is ancient graffiti. And in fact, if you look close, you may get lucky and find this one from Byron. This is actually the Byron, George Gordon, Lord Byron, the very famous British Philhellene who fought in the War for Greek independence and eventually died in Missolonghi in 1824. But here he is, carved his name in the temple. In addition to the Poseidon temple, there was also a fortress. As you can imagine, on a promontory like this, it's a logical place to put one. And there was also an important temple to Athena, although that is completely gone. There's really nothing left but a few small bits of foundation. But particularly if the weather is nice, and I would recommend not going on a weekend because that's when it's busiest. I was lucky enough to be there when there were hardly any people there. The other time that's a very popular time to go is in the evening because the sunsets from Sunion are absolutely spectacular. Unfortunately, you will be there along with hundreds and hundreds of people trying to get pictures of the same sunset you are. So it is kind of worth it to go when, as beautiful as that is, it's worth it to go when there aren't as many people. The plant that you can see in the front here that looks like heather is actually wild thyme. And when I was there in June, it was in bloom all over the country, not just in Athens, but pretty much everywhere I traveled. And it's amazing because if you walk through the brush like this, as you brush it with your pants, it releases this beautiful scent of thyme as you walk around. And whole hillsides can be covered with the purple flowers. It's just beautiful. And of course, the water, as usual in Greece, is crystal clear, beautiful, wonderful for swimming, particularly in the summer. In fact, even last month, mid-November, you can still pretty much swim in Greece. It's starting to get cold at that point, but. And back in Athens, I'll end with just a few nighttime photos as the sun is going down. Here you can see the view from the Cavitos looking back out towards a fleet of, I think those are cargo ships off in the distance. And the hills to the west have a number of wind turbines. And Greece in general is getting really big into wind energy. There's a lot of wind and a lot of empty mountaintops to put them on. So it's becoming an important part of the energy mix in Greece, as is solar power as well, as you can imagine. But the sun setting over from the views, if you're lucky enough to get up high, either on the Acropolis or the Cavitos and watch the sunset over the city, it's really quite magical. So I will end there. Looks like we're just on time. And I am going to stop sharing my screen. And then if anyone has any questions, I will be happy to feel free to unmute yourself and I'll answer any questions I can, or if anyone has any comments. Anyone?
Hi, Jeff.
Hi.
So we did have a couple of questions. Rosman wanted to know if the cost of living is higher in Greece.
Higher than here?
I'm assuming that she means higher than here.
Yeah. Oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's well, there are pros and cons to that. One of the reasons that the cost of living is low is because the economy is a mess. So if an American travels there, it's a very inexpensive place to travel. Just to give you an example, the beautiful apartment, which is huge. It's almost an entire floor. It has a kitchen. It has air conditioning. It has a whole balcony with a view of the Acropolis. It's about 60 euros a night with Airbnb, and that's not unusual for accommodations in Athens. Food is like restaurant meals, I would say, are comparable to traveling elsewhere, but they're not outrageous. It's not like Paris or London. In general, I would say it's a relatively inexpensive place to travel. However, having said that, when you say the cost of living, that's different, because then you're talking about people who actually live there. And for people who live there, it's very different, because there's very high unemployment. The austerity measures that were put on them by the European Union over the past 10 years since the economic collapse were very, very bad. A lot of people lost their pensions or had them seriously reduced. So for people living in Greece, the cost of living is low, but so is the income. Having said that, they have national health insurance, and they have a lot of things that we don't have. And it's a very different lifestyle, as you can imagine. So the pace of life is a bit slower, and it's, for me, it's a beautiful place. And I think for any American traveling there, it's great. It's a very economical place to travel.
So when I was looking into moving to England at one point in my life, early life, there was some question as to whether or not the people who lived there, who grew up there, would be sort of not very friendly to me as a foreigner coming in there and taking a job. Do you think that's the case for Greece too? Like if you were to move there and try to get employment?
Good question. Possibly, although it might depend on the particular job you were in, because they've had a brain drain, as a number of other countries had. So if you are providing a service that they desperately need, that might be different. I don't really know. In general, Greece is extremely friendly and open to travelers. No question about that, because it's money in their pockets. Even the Germans, and believe me, the Greeks are not terribly fond of the German government, largely because of it was Germany who led the austerity push against them. But they very much differentiate that from an ordinary German traveler. Although it's funny, when I was there last month, some friends of ours from here in Wakefield visited us there and stayed with us while we were there for a few days. And they were in Athens a couple of weeks before we were, and they stayed in a hotel where, totally by accident, they did not plan this at all. Angela Merkel was there from Germany for some high-level meetings and so forth, and they were in the hotel bar, and Angela Merkel came in. It was kind of incredible. But they are definitely one of the poorer countries in Europe. On the other hand, in the Balkans and in Eastern Europe, they're probably doing better than most of them. So it's kind of a mix. Someone in the chat was mentioning about remote work, and that's certainly an option. A problem for Americans working remotely in Greece would mainly be the time difference, but totally depends on your work and what you're doing and what your company does. And so it's certainly a possibility. And if you lived there, there are a lot of wonderful things about living in Greece. We have a house there, but it's a vacation home, and we don't have any particular plans to live there full time. But the more time I spend there, the more appealing a lot of aspects of it seem. But again, there's a huge difference between Athens and village life or small towns, in much the same way that moving to the United States, there's a big difference between living in New York and living in Western Mass. They're not the same. So Greece has similar issues.
So did you? So you said that you speak Greek.
That's generous, but yes,
You can communicate.
I am sort of low intermediate at this point. I can carry on a decent conversation and make myself understood and mostly understand what people are telling me if they don't talk too fast. Greeks love anyone who makes any attempt to speak Greek, because so few people do, that if you know any of it, they're a very welcoming, very friendly people. And they're very forgiving about any mistakes that you might make. And of course, most of them speak English, particularly in Athens, everybody speaks English. In any place where tourism is a big part of the economy, everyone speaks English, or certainly enough to communicate. But I enjoy practicing my Greek when I'm there, because it's the only way to learn. It's the only way to get better.
That's wonderful.
Somebody mentioned Albanians too. I'm checking the chat.
Question and answer, but yeah, if something comes over the
of
chat,
course,
go ahead.
Albania is not currently part of the EU. They hope to be somewhere someday, but they're economically way, way down. But there are a lot of Albanians in Greece, and depending on where you are, that can be good or bad. Actually, the people who watch our house when we're not there are an Albanian couple who have been living there for years. Interestingly, Albanians, a lot of the Albanian immigrants are known for extremely high quality stonework, which is very popular in Greece, as you can imagine. Most buildings are made out of stone. The picture behind me is my Zoom picture is I'm sitting on the roof of our house, which is made of stone, and a lot of it is Albanian stonework from immigrants that came from Albania. But yes, there are a lot of immigration issues there, not just with Albania, but on the other side of the country, refugees, migrants. There are big problems with Iraqis, Syrians, people from the Middle East who are fleeing horrible situations in war-torn countries or poverty-stricken countries like Syria and so forth. And they're coming through Turkey, where it is well, I shouldn't say easy, relatively easy by boat to get to Greek islands, which are often within sight of the Turkish shoreline. So they have migrant camps, and it's a bad situation. It's been going on for several years, particularly since the war in Syria picked up in around 2015 or so. So that is less noticeable in Athens and the western part of the country, but in the islands, it's a big problem. And there's, depending on your political persuasion, which is all over the map there, just like it is here, people either have a great deal of sympathy for that, or they are very much opposed to it. There are very conservative elements, anti-immigrant elements, and the opposite. So it's complicated. And Greece, certainly the Greek government is not as strong as, say, France or Germany or a place like that. They have fewer resources, and it's harder for them to cope with being on the front lines of a crisis like that.
Yeah, because they just barely recovered from. Have they even recovered from a recession yet? No.
not really. I mean,
Yeah.
they're considerably better off than they were 10 years ago, absolutely. But unemployment is still high. Fortunately, tourism has really bounced back. And
Yeah, yeah.
I read something very surprising, that Greece was the only country, it wasn't worldwide, but it was in the EU. Greece was the only country during the pandemic that actually saw a rise in tourist visits.
Wow.
Not a big one, but and they did pretty well during the pandemic until last fall. And
Yeah.
so this past fall. So things have been, they were doing very, very well up until like September or so. And so although their bad is still nowhere near where we are, and they have much stricter COVID measures than we do. So they're trying to get it under control. And unless you're in very crowded places like, clubs and the biggest problems they're having are places like that, very concentrated areas of high tourism and people flocking to clubs and things like that. Where we go in Greece, there's hardly any people anyway. So.
Yeah, right. So like, I think that's across Europe. I mean, the denser cities
Yeah.
and that are the reason why, I mean, Europe in general is more densely populated than
Yeah.
the US. So it's probably.
But there's always certainly going to be a big difference between whether you're in London or a little village up in the Cotswolds, or whether you're in Paris or, yeah.
So Teresa did want to know, though, going back to the language, what is the name of the language tutors you use on YouTube?
Oh, it's called easygreek.com.
Okay.
I highly recommend them. They're lots of fun. Dimitris and Marilou, and they have other people as well. They do, you can subscribe with money. They have a monthly fee that you can subscribe at different levels for different benefits. But there's a whole lot of stuff that you can get completely for free. And you can certainly watch their videos, and they have exercises and things like that. It's a lot of fun.
Cool.
And it's been fun for me to meet other people who are trying to learn the language. And yeah, it's kind of fun. I do a lot of others as well, and this is true of certainly not just Greek, but almost any foreign language now. The internet is such a great way to learn foreign languages, because there are all kinds of people on YouTube who are doing language lessons and short videos, and there are platforms where you can actually pay someone to do tutoring online. And one of the few good things I think to come out of the pandemic is so many more people are now used to doing online video chatting than there were before. So many of these language places you can be speaking with a native speaker on the other side of the world, and do it over Zoom just as easily as someone in your town. So that's kind of nice, because it gives a lot more opportunities for people to learn foreign languages with native speakers on their own schedule, and you can't beat that.
Yeah, that for sure. That's amazing. Then Teresa also has a couple of other questions. Firstly, what types of events are currently held at the stadium, and what kinds of events took place there when it was first built?
You mean the Panathenaic Stadium?
She did not
Probably.
Specify.
Yeah, from the way the question's phrased, that's my guess. Because the modern stadiums are just typical modern sports arenas that host all kinds of events. The Panathenaic one, that is an original ancient stadium that was rebuilt for the first modern Olympics. I don't actually know. I'm not. I'm embarrassed to say this, particularly as someone with Greek heritage. I have zero interest in the Olympics. I never follow them. I never pay attention to them. So I don't actually know. what they do. But it is a museum, and I know they do use it periodically for big sports events, but I don't know exactly what. Obviously, given the fact that it's an ancient arena with a very specific design, you can only do certain kinds of things there. It's not a modern arena where you could play, where you could have a football match or something like that. It was built for chariot racing, so but I should look into that. I don't actually know the answer.
Primarily a museum, I think, and then they use it for other things. Yeah, but I agree with you. The Olympics are not what they used to be, right? Joan, no. Jeff is not. Jeff is a retired librarian who just happens to travel an awful lot and do these presentations. I don't think that you can plan trips for people. Is that correct, Jeff?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Jeff is not a travel agent.
I am not a travel agent. I'm happy to give personal advice from what I know, but no. And in fact, a number of people have. This is going to sound kind of. I hope this doesn't come out the wrong way, but a lot of people have said to me, "Oh, I would love to. You should organize tours and take people on tours." And I can't think of anything more horrible, to be perfectly honest with you.
So it's not the second chapter for you then.
No. I have always been an independent traveler. I like being on my own. In fact, even having house guests or traveling with friends is always, ripe for problems. But no, taking a busload of people on a tour, no. I'm much happier doing it this way. However,
and we love that you do it this way too.
However, having said that, I do want people to know, do feel free. I'm always happy to talk by email. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. Anyone who has any comments or questions, I'm not a travel agent, but I'm happy to tell you whatever I do know and answer any questions you may have. Always happy to do that.
That's great. I think that was Joan. The second part of Joan's question was, what would you suggest? And so what I'll do for everybody is I will send out the recording of this presentation tomorrow, and I will include Jeff Klapes's email if you'd like to reach out to him. And also just know that many of his other presentations are already available online on YouTube. So you can see some of the other destinations, and hopefully we'll be able to have Jeff back again. Did you see any other? I haven't checked the chat lately. Is there anything else that you see there?
I'm looking through. I see some nice compliments. Thank you.
Yes. Yes.
I don't think.
Yeah.
I think we got them all.
The photography. Yes. Jeff takes all of his own photographs. Am I correct on that, Jeff?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
They're amazing. They're so good.
That's one of the things I like about traveling. I'm an amateur photographer, and so it's always a chance for me to play around with my camera. And yeah.
Yes, that should be your next profession, I think. But thank you so much, Jeff. And we really appreciate you coming online with us. And thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me. Nice to see
night.
everybody again, and hope to see you sometime soon.
Good night.
Good night.